Big Fork, Montana, December 25th. The snow buries the fence posts in a bone-white silence, but the real frost is at the dinner table. My name is Kate Reynolds, and tonight I am being erased from my own family. My brother wears the arrogance of a mogul while my parents hand me an eviction notice as a Christmas gift. They see a failure. They do not see the $500,000 ledger in my pocket. How long can you mock a woman before you realize she owns the very floor beneath your feet? Tonight, the ice finally breaks. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The snow had started in the morning, and by 4 o'clock it had buried the fence posts. It was a dry Montana snow that bit at the skin and turned the world a flat bone white. Inside the house, the air was thick with the smell of rosemary and the heavy, sweet scent of roasting turkey. The furnace hummed in the basement, a low, steady sound that did not quite cover the rattling of the window panes when the wind kicked up from the valley. I sat at the kitchen table and watched my mother Martha move between the counter and the stove. She moved with a sharp, practiced efficiency, her heels clicking on the linoleum. She did not look at me. To her, I was a fixture of the house, like the chipped paint on the baseboards, or the draft that came in under the back door. I wore an old gray sweater that had grown thin at the elbows. It was warm enough for the house, but it looked poor. That was the point. For 6 months I had played the part of the daughter who had come home with her tail between her legs. I had let them believe the city had broken me. I had let them believe the bank account was dry and the ambition was dead. It was easier that way. It was a clean way to live, watching them from the shadows of their own low expectations. My father Harold came in from the porch. He smelled of wood smoke and cold air. He stamped his boots by the door and hung his heavy coat on the peg. He looked at me for a moment, his eyes hard and gray like the winter sky, and then he looked away. He did not ask how I was. He did not ask if I needed anything. He went to the sideboard and poured himself a finger of rye. He drank it standing up, looking out the window at the white nothingness of the yard. The house was full of things that had been there since I was a child, but it felt smaller now. It felt like a box that was being slowly crushed. I stayed quiet. I had learned that in this family, silence was the only thing that didn't get used against you. If you didn't speak, they had to invent your failures, and they were very good at inventing them. They had decided I was the caretaker by default. I was the one who stayed in the childhood bedroom to save on rent. I was the one who helped with the groceries and the property taxes because I had nowhere else to go. They saw it as charity. I saw it as a long, slow investment in the truth. Then the headlights cut through the snow in the driveway. A heavy German SUV pulled up the engine, a low, expensive growl that seemed to mock the silence of the woods. That was Leo. My brother was 3 years older than me, and twice as loud. He lived in a world of handshakes and high-interest loans, a world where the loudest man in the room was always the one who was right. He came through the door like a conquering hero, throwing his keys on the counter and filling the room with the smell of expensive leather and confidence. He was wearing a coat that cost more than the property taxes on the house. He hugged my mother and shook my father's hand with a grip that was meant to be felt. When he looked at me, he smiled the way a man smiles at a dog that hasn't quite learned to sit. It was a smile of pity, and it was the heaviest thing in the room. He didn't say hello. He just nodded and reached into a wooden crate he had carried in. He pulled out a bottle of Cabernet. The label was minimalist and elegant. He held it up so the light from the chandelier caught the deep red of the glass. He told them it was a $200 bottle. He said it was a vintage that most people couldn't get their hands on, but he had connections now. He spoke about the tannins and the oak as if he were reciting a prayer. My father nodded, his face softening the way it only did for Leo. My mother brought out the good crystal glasses, the ones she usually kept wrapped in tissue paper in the high cabinet. They were thin and delicate. I watched them move around him, a small, adoring orbit. I stayed in my chair. I was drinking water from a plastic tumbler. The water was cold and tasted of the well iron and earth. It was honest. We moved to the dining room. The table was set with the linen cloth that had belonged to my grandmother. It was white and stiff with starch. The silver was polished until it shone like ice. Leo took the seat at the head of the table, the seat my father usually occupied, but Harold didn't seem to mind. He sat to Leo's right, looking at his son with a pride that was almost painful to witness. I sat across from them next to my mother. The turkey was placed in the center, steaming and golden, surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes and gravy that was thick and dark. It was a good meal. It was a meal meant for a family that loved each other, but we ate it like soldiers in a trench waiting for the first shot to be fired. Leo poured the wine. He filled his glass, then my father's, then my mother's. He stopped when he got to me. He looked at my plastic tumbler and then at the bottle. He said it would be a waste to pour such a fine vintage into a plastic cup. He said it with a laugh, but the laugh didn't reach his eyes. My mother chimed in, saying that I probably wouldn't appreciate the complexity of it anyway. She said I had always been more of a basic person. They laughed together, a small, sharp sound that cut through the warmth of the room. I didn't say anything. I took a bite of the turkey. It was dry. I chewed it slowly and swallowed. I looked at the fire in the hearth. The logs were birch, and they popped and hissed as the sap heated up. The light cast long, flickering shadows against the walls. The conversation stayed on Leo. It always did. He talked about his new restaurant, The Hearth. He talked about the location in the city, the reclaimed wood floors, the artisan menus, and the way the critics were already buzzing about the opening. He spoke with a fever in his voice, the kind of excitement that usually precedes a crash. My father asked about the overhead, and Leo brushed it off with a wave of his hand. He said he had it all under control. He said he had found the perfect partner, someone who knew when to stay quiet and let the talent work. He called his investor an angel, but the way he said it made it sound like he'd found a fool. He leaned back in his chair, his chest expanded, his glass held loosely in his hand. He looked like a man who owned the world, and my parents looked at him like he was the one who had created it. I watched the way the wine moved in his glass. It was dark, almost purple. I thought about the iceberg theory I had read about once, how only 1/8 of an iceberg is above the water and the rest is hidden beneath the surface. That was how I felt at that table. Above the water, I was the failed daughter, the house guest, the woman in the thin sweater who added no value. Below the water, there was the $500,000. There was the LLC. There was the contract with the morality clause that Leo had signed without reading the fine print because he was too busy looking at his own reflection in the mahogany desk. There was the fact that I owned the very chair he was sitting in. But the time for the bottom of the iceberg to rise hadn't come yet. The exposition was nearly over. The scene was set, the roles were assigned, and the winter night was closing in. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 7. The snow was still falling, silent and relentless, burying the world deeper with every passing minute. I took another sip of my well water and waited for the first strike. The wine had begun to take hold of Leo. His face was flushed, a dull red that matched the curtains, and his voice had grown an octave louder, vibrating against the low-beamed ceiling. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the white linen, a gesture that would have earned me a sharp reprimand as a child. Tonight he was the golden sun, and the rules of the house bent toward him like grass in a high wind. He began to talk about the money. It was the only thing he really enjoyed, talking about the mechanics of leverage and the sweetness of a deal. He spoke of his restaurant, The Hearth, not as a place to eat but as a monument to his own foresight. He told us he had finally closed the gap. He had secured a secret investor, a silent partner who had moved $500,000 into his accounts with a single wire transfer. He called it angel money, but his tone was anything but reverent. He laughed, a short, sharp sound that was as cold as the wind outside. He said he had found a ghost with deep pockets and a shallow mind, someone who didn't even care about a seat on the board. He was a mogul now, he said. He used the word without irony. He looked at my father and said that in this country, you are either the one holding the checkbook or the one waiting for the crumbs to fall? My mother Martha smiled at him with a terrifying softness. She reached out and patted his hand, her rings catching the light of the fire. Then she turned that smile toward me, but it had changed. It had grown thin and hard. She asked me if I understood what it took to build something like that. She didn't wait for an answer. She told me that while Leo was out in the world making things happen, I was just taking up space. She used the word unemployed as if it were a physical ailment, something contagious that she was tired of having in her home. She said they had been patient. They had given me a roof and a bed because I was blood, but blood only went so far when the pulse was as weak as mine. She looked at the empty seat next to me and said that every chair at this table had to be earned. My father joined in then. He set his fork down with a heavy silver clatter that silenced the room. He told me that a person's worth was measured by the value they added to the community, to the family, to the world. He looked me in the eye and said that I added no value. He said I was a passenger who had forgotten to pay the fare. The humiliation was a physical weight. It was the heat of the fire on my back and the coldness of their words in my chest. Leo leaned back, enjoying the show. He told me not to take it personally, that some people were just built to be support staff, while others were built to lead. He called me a professional houseguest. He said it was a shame I had no skin in the game, no ambition to be anything more than a shadow in my own life. He started describing the renovations he wanted to make to the house now that he was a success. He talked about an executive office, a place where he could run his empire from the quiet of the woods. He looked at my mother and said the guest room. My room had the best light for a desk. My mother nodded. She didn't hesitate. She looked at me and told me that I needed to pack. She said they were tired of hosting a ghost. They wanted the room for Leo's office, and they wanted it tonight. I asked her where I was supposed to go. The snow was still falling outside, and the roads over the pass were likely closed to anything without four-wheel drive and a death wish. I said it was Christmas. My father didn't blink. He said that personal freedom meant the freedom to fail on your own terms. He said he had raised me to be resilient, and if I hadn't learned that yet, then the cold would be a good teacher. He told me I had until the end of dinner to get my things together. He said the mogul needed his space, and the house guest had overstayed her welcome. They went back to their meal, then talking over me as if I had already vanished. Leo poured the last of the Cabernet into his glass, his movements fluid and arrogant. He was a man who believed the world was a series of doors that would always open for him because he had the keys. He didn't realize that the locks had already been changed. I sat there and felt the silence of the iceberg theory working within me. Below the surface of my thin sweater and my quiet demeanor, there was the heavy machinery of my own life. I thought about the bank records stored on my phone. I thought about the LLC documents tucked into the side pocket of my suitcase upstairs. I thought about the morality clause section 4.2, which stated that any public disparagement of the primary creditor or the brand's reputation by the operator would result in an immediate acceleration of the debt. I had watched him all night. I had watched him mock the stupid investor who had given him the lifeblood for his dream. I had watched him treat his own sister like a servant in front of the very people who had taught him how to be cruel. He had breached the contract 10 times over before the main course was even finished. The American dream, the way my father spoke of it, was about grit and the ownership of one's destiny. They thought I had none of it because I didn't brag, because I didn't wear my bank account on my sleeve, and because I had chosen to be the one who listened instead of the one who shouted. They saw my silence as a void. They didn't understand that silence is often where the most dangerous things are built. I looked at the three of them, my brother, the mogul, my mother, the social climber, and my father, the judge. They were so certain of their positions. They were so sure that the world belonged to the loud. I felt a strange kind of peace. It was the peace of a hunter who has spent all day in the cold and finally sees the target move into the clearing. I didn't argue. I didn't beg for more time. I simply stood up from the table. My chair made a soft sound on the rug. I told them I would go and get my things. Leo didn't even look up. He was too busy telling my father about the marble he wanted for the bar at the restaurant. My mother told me to make sure I didn't leave any of my clutter behind. I walked out of the dining room and toward the stairs. Each step felt light. The house felt like it was already receding into the distance, a small, dark place that I was finally outgrowing. The rising action was peaking. The pressure was high, the air was thin, and the storm outside was exactly what I needed. I reached the landing and looked down at them one last time. They looked small from up there. They looked like people who had forgotten that the most important part of an iceberg is the part you can't see until it's too late. The knock was 3 sharp raps. It was a hard sound, a mechanical sound that had nothing to do with the wind or the settling of the house. It cut through Leo's voice like a saw through green wood. He had been in the middle of a story about a vintner in Napa, but he stopped his glass halfway to his mouth. My father looked at the door. He looked at the clock. It was nearly 8. No one came to the house this late on Christmas, not with the roads turning into sheets of black glass. My father stood up. He moved slowly, his knees popping. He went to the foyer and I followed him, staying in the shadow of the hallway. When he opened the door, the winter rushed in. It was a violent, frozen thing that stripped the warmth from the room in a second. Standing on the porch was Miller. He was a man with a face like a plowed field, hard and lined and weathered by 50 years of Montana winters. He was wearing a heavy canvas coat and a cap pulled low. He didn't look happy to be there. He was a legal courier, a man I had known for years, a man who understood the weight of paper. He didn't say Merry Christmas. He didn't ask to come in. He just looked at my father, and then looked past him, searching the room until his eyes found Leo. Miller reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy manila envelope. It was sealed with a strip of red tape. He stepped into the foyer, leaving a trail of gray slush on the rug. My father asked him what this was about. Miller didn't answer him. He walked straight into the dining room, where the candles were flickering in the draft. He set the envelope on the table right next to Leo's glass of Cabernet. He said he had been instructed to deliver it personally and to wait for a signature of receipt. Leo looked at the envelope as if it were a poisonous snake. He laughed, but the sound was thin and brittle. He asked Miller if this was some kind of joke, some elaborate prank for the new mogul in town. Miller didn't laugh, he just handed Leo a pen. Leo signed it because he didn't know what else to do, his hand shaking just enough to make the ink stagger across the line. Miller took the clipboard back, nodded once to me in the shadows, and walked out back into the storm. The door clicked shut, and the silence that followed was heavier than the snow. Leo tore the envelope open. His movements were frantic now, the arrogance stripped away, to reveal a raw, nervous energy. He pulled out a thick stack of documents. I walked into the room and took my seat again. My mother was watching Leo's face. My father was standing by the sideboard, his hands gripped tight behind his back. The first page was a notice of default and immediate acceleration of debt. It was printed on the heavy cream-colored letterhead of Blue Spruce Holdings LLC. Leo's eyes moved rapidly across the lines. He started to shake his head. He said it was a mistake. He said the bank had messed up the wire. He said his investor, his angel, would never do this. He looked at the figure at the bottom of the page. $500,000 plus interest due in full within 24 hours. He looked at the second document. It was a cease and desist regarding the property at 402 Main Street, the site of the hearth. It was followed by a notice of foreclosure. He looked up at my father. He told him that someone was trying to rob him. He said his investor had turned on him for no reason. He started to curse, his voice rising until it was a yell. He called the investor a coward. He called them a snake who was trying to steal his hard work. I sat there and watched the fire. I felt the cold from the open door still lingering around my ankles. I told him it wasn't a robbery. I told him it was a contract. My mother turned to me, her eyes narrow and sharp. She told me to stay out of it. She said I didn't understand how business worked. She said I should go back upstairs and stay in my room until I was ready to leave. I didn't move. I looked at Leo. I asked him if he had read Section 4.2 of the partnership agreement. I asked him if he remembered the bad boy clause. The room went very still. Leo looked at me, his mouth open. He asked me how I knew about the clause. I told him that I knew about it because I had written it. I told him that I was Blue Spruce Holdings. I told him that the stupid investor who didn't care about a seat on the board was the sister he had been mocking for 6 months. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a deep woods after a kill. My mother's hand went to her throat. My father looked at me as if he were seeing a stranger who had climbed through the window. Leo started to laugh again, but it was a wet, desperate sound. He said I was lying. He said I didn't have that kind of money. He said I was a failure who lived in a bedroom with floral wallpaper and saved pennies. I didn't argue with him. I reached into the pocket of my old sweater and pulled out a small black ledger. I set it on the table. I told him that I had been the unemployed daughter because it was a quiet way to live. I told him that while he was out buying leather coats and Italian marble, I had been buying property. I had been buying debt. I told him that I had given him the 500,000 because I wanted to believe he could be more than a loudmouth. I wanted to see if the money would change him or just make him more of what he already was. I had my answer. He had breached the morality clause. He had publicly disparaged the primary creditor. He had brought the brand into disrepute by treating the very source of his funding with contempt. And tonight he had sat at this table and told me I added no value. He had sat there while our parents told me to get out into the cold. The logic was simple. In business, you protect your assets. You do not fund people who wish for your ruin. You do not build houses for people who want to burn them down. Leo looked at the papers again. He saw the signature on the bottom of the master agreement. It wasn't a ghost's name, it was mine, Kate Reynolds. Kate, managing director. He looked at the notice of immediate acceleration. It meant the dream was over. The stoves he had bought, the reclaimed wood floors, he had bragged about, the lease on the building, it all belonged to the holding company now. It all belonged to me. He started to plead. He said he was sorry. He said he was just joking around, that the wine had made him talk big. He looked at our mother for help, but she was looking at me. She was looking at the ledger on the table. She was looking at the daughter she had just tried to evict. The power in the room had shifted. It hadn't shifted with a bang. It had shifted like the tide. It was a cold, inevitable movement. My father tried to speak, but the words seemed to fail him. He had spent his life talking about resilience and personal freedom, about the grit it took to own one's destiny. He was looking at the personification of those values, and it wasn't his son. It was the woman he had told to pack her bags. I felt the weight of the iceberg theory finally surfacing. The 7/8 that had been hidden beneath the water, the work, the planning, the cold-blooded patience was now visible. It was a mountain of ice, and Leo's little boat had just hit it at full speed. He wasn't a mogul. He was a man with a stack of papers and a debt he couldn't pay. The climax was here, and the fire in the hearth was dying down, leaving us all in the gathering cold. The room did not just get quiet. It went cold. It was the kind of cold that starts in the marrow and works its way out to the skin. The heat from the fireplace seemed to pull back, retreating into the bricks, leaving us in a hollow gray space. Leo sat staring at the documents, his fingers white where they gripped the edges of the paper. My mother was the first to move. She reached out her hand, hovering over my arm, but she didn't quite touch the wool of my sweater. Her voice was different now. The sharpness had been sanded down, replaced by a soft, trembling quality that felt like a new kind of lie. She called me honey. She said they hadn't meant the things they said. She said that Harold and she were only trying to push me to spark some fire in my soul because they knew I was capable of greatness. She said it was a parent's job to be the anvil so the child could become the hammer. It was a clumsy pivot, a desperate reaching for a bridge that I had already burned from my end. I looked at her and saw the fear in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of losing a daughter. It was the fear of having insulted the person who held the ledger. Harold cleared his throat. He stood by the sideboard, the glass of rye forgotten. He tried to straighten his shoulders to reclaim the role of the patriarch. He said that family was a sacred thing, a bond that existed outside the lines of a contract. He spoke about the American values we shared: loyalty, resilience, the way the Reynolds family always looked out for their own. He said we could fix this. He said we could sit down tomorrow when the sun was up and the wine had cleared and redraw the terms so that everyone walked away happy. He spoke as if the last hour hadn't happened. He spoke as if he hadn't told me to be out by morning. I watched him and felt nothing. It was a clean feeling. It was the feeling of a hunter looking at a dry creek bed. There was no water there, and there never would be again. Leo finally looked up. His face was a mask of ruin. He started to talk about the stoves. He said he had spent $60,000 on the range alone. He talked about the hand-carved tables made from white oak and the lease he had signed for the next 10 years. He said the restaurant was his life. He said I couldn't just take it. I leaned back in my chair. The wood creaked. I told him he didn't sign a lease with a stranger. I told him that Blue Spruce Holdings had purchased the building at 402 Main Street 3 months ago. I had bought it from the old man who owned the hardware store next door. He had wanted out, and I had wanted the dirt. Leo hadn't been paying rent to a faceless corporation. He had been paying it into an escrow account I controlled. I told him that the tables and the stoves were collateral for the loan. According to the default terms he had just signed, they were no longer his. They belonged to the holding company. They were assets on a balance sheet now, not pieces of a dream. The reality hit him then, a physical blow that made him slump in his chair. He realized that he owned nothing. He was a man standing in a beautiful room that belonged to someone else wearing clothes he couldn't afford, fueled by a pride that had no foundation. He started to scream. It wasn't a scream of anger. It was the sound of a trapped animal, loud and discordant and empty. He called me names. He stood up and kicked his chair back, the heavy oak thudding against the floorboards. He told me I was a monster. He told me I had planned this from the start, that I had sat in this house like a spider waiting for him to trip. He screamed until his voice cracked, until the spit flew from his lips and landed on the white linen tablecloth. My mother tried to quiet him, but he pushed her hand away. He was a mogul who had lost his empire before the first stake was ever charred. I remained still. I was Hemingway, still a rock in the middle of a rushing stream. I did not scream back. I did not offer excuses. I did not tell him how much it had hurt to hear them plan my eviction, while I was the one keeping the lights on. I simply waited for the noise to stop. When he finally ran out of breath, I spoke in a voice that was level and dry. I told him the facts. I told him that the restaurant would not open on January 1st. I had already instructed the legal team to change the locks and post the notices. The grand opening banners he had printed were garbage now. I told him that the loan was accelerated, the building was closed, and the equipment was being inventoried for liquidation. He was no longer the operator. He was a debtor in default. He looked at my father begging for an intervention, but Harold had nothing left to give. My father looked at the documents on the table, and then at me. He saw the logic of it. He had spent his life preaching the cold, hard truth of the market, and now the market had come home to roost in his own dining room. He saw that I was the one who had followed his rules. I was the one who had exercised personal freedom. I was the one who had shown the resilience to survive their contempt, and the community-mindedness to fund a brother who didn't deserve it until he proved he was a liability. The value, I added, was now the only value left in the room. My mother began to cry, a soft sniffling sound that didn't move me. She talked about the neighbors, about what people would say if Leo's restaurant failed before it started. She talked about the shame of a family feud. I told her that shame was a luxury for people who didn't have to worry about the rent. I told her that for 6 months I had lived with the shame they had projected onto me, and I had found that it was a very light burden once you stopped believing in it. I told her that the neighbors would see exactly what was true, that Leo had overextended himself and failed to meet his obligations. It was a common story. It was an American story. Leo sat back down. He looked small. The expensive leather coat looked too big for him now, as if he were a child playing dress-up in his father's closet. He asked me what I was going to do with the building. I told him that wasn't his concern anymore. I told him that I might turn it into a gallery, or I might just let it sit empty until the right tenant came along. The point was that it was mine to decide. I held the keys, and I held the debt. The falling action was nearly complete. The high heat of the confrontation had evaporated, leaving behind the cold, hard structure of the truth. The cracks in the ice had widened until the whole surface had given way, and they were all treading water in the dark. I looked at the turkey in the center of the table. It was cold now. The grease had congealed into a white film. It was a dead thing, and so was the life they thought they were living. I stood up and pushed my chair in. It made a clean, sharp sound against the floor. I had stated the facts, and the facts were all that remained. The hallway was a tunnel of shadow that smelled of floor wax and the ghost of dinners past. I walked up the stairs, my hand sliding over the smooth, cold banister. I did not feel the weight of the house anymore. I did not feel the pressure of the expectations that had been piled on me like heavy blankets for 6 months. I reached the landing and went into my room. The floral wallpaper looked different in the dark. It looked like a garden that had been frozen in time, beautiful and useless. My bag was already sitting on the bed. It was a large olive drab duffel made of heavy canvas. I had packed it 3 days ago, not because I knew they would try to kick me out, but because I knew I was finished with the play. I had played the part of the failure long enough to see the ending, and the ending was exactly what I had expected it to be. I zipped the bag. The sound of the metal teeth biting together was loud and final in the small room. I didn't look at the bed or the desk or the window. I didn't need to say goodbye to the room. It was just a place where I had waited for the ice to get thick enough to walk on. I carried the bag down the stairs. It was heavy, but it was a good weight. It was the weight of a life that belonged to me and no one else. When I reached the bottom, I saw them still sitting in the dining room. They looked like figures in a wax museum. The candles had burned down to stubs, and the light was flickering, casting long, jerky shadows across their faces. Leo was staring at the stack of documents Miller had left behind. My mother was clutching a linen napkin as if it were a life preserver. My father had his head bowed, his hands flat on the table. They looked like people who had been told the world was flat and had just reached the edge. I stood in the doorway with my bag. I didn't put it down. My father looked up. He saw the bag. He saw the coat I was wearing, a heavy sheepskin jacket that was meant for the mountains, not for the city. He asked me where I was going. He said the roads were dangerous. He said we should talk about the future of the house. I looked at him. I told him I wasn't going to a hotel or a friend's place. I was going to my own home, the one I had bought in the valley 2 years ago and never told them about. I told him that I hadn't stayed here because I was broke. I had stayed here because I wanted to see if they were still the people I remembered. I wanted to see if there was any room for a person who didn't shout about their successes. I told him I had my answer. He tried to speak, to offer some paternal wisdom about the hardness of the world, but the words died in his throat. He realized he couldn't lecture a woman who owned his son's future. I walked to the sideboard. I looked at the bottle of Cabernet. It was nearly empty. I looked at my mother. I told her that she had been right about one thing: value is something you have to prove. But she had been wrong about who was providing it. I told her to look at the property tax receipts for the last 3 years. I told her that the anonymous grant they had received from the county to help with the historic preservation of the house hadn't come from the government. It had come from Blue Spruce Holdings. I had been paying the taxes, the insurance, and the structural repairs through the LLC for 36 months. I had been the one keeping the roof over their heads while they sat at this table and talked about my lack of value. I told her that the mogul she was so proud of hadn't contributed a dime to this house since he left for college. He had only taken. I had been the silent foundation, and tonight I was moving the house off the rocks. My mother's face went white. She looked at my father, then at Leo. The reality of her life was shifting beneath her. The pride she felt for her son was a hollow thing, a shell with nothing inside. The daughter she had dismissed was the only reason she wasn't living in a two-bedroom apartment in town. I told her that the arrangement would continue for now. I wouldn't put them on the street. I wasn't Leo. I followed the contracts I signed, even the ones I made with myself. But the house belonged to the LLC now. They were tenants. They would receive a lease agreement in the mail next week. It would be a fair lease, but it would be a lease. There would be no more family charity, because they had made it clear that they didn't believe in it. Leo looked at me then. There was no more anger in his eyes, only a dull, pleading sort of hope. He asked me what would happen to the hearth. He asked if I would let him manage it if he apologized. I looked at him and I felt a brief flash of pity, but it passed quickly. It was the kind of pity you feel for a dead tree that needs to be cleared before it falls on the fence. I told him no. I told him that he had proven he wasn't a leader. He was a man who mistreated his partners and mocked his investors. In the world of business, that makes you a liability. I told him I would find a chef who understood the value of a quiet partner. I would find someone who knew how to cook and how to keep their word. I told him he should go find a job. A real one. One where he didn't have to be a mogul. I walked to the front door. The air coming through the cracks was sharp and smelled of pine and frozen earth. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The storm had slowed, but the snow was still falling in large, lazy flakes that drifted through the light of the porch lamp. The world was silent. The only sound was the distant rumble of a snowplow out on the highway. I walked down the steps, my boots crunching in the fresh powder. It was a good sound. It was the sound of movement. I reached my truck, a heavy black 4x4 that was built for this kind of night. I threw my bag into the passenger seat and climbed in. The interior smelled of cold leather and coffee. I turned the key. The engine roared to life, a powerful, steady vibration that felt like a heartbeat against my ribs. I sat there for a moment, letting the heater warm up. I looked back at the house. The lights were still on in the dining room. I could see the silhouettes of my family through the frost on the window panes. They were still sitting there, frozen in the wreckage of their own ego. They looked small. They looked like a photograph from a life I didn't live anymore. I shifted the truck into gear. The tires bit into the snow, and I began to roll down the long, winding driveway. I didn't look back again. I focused on the road ahead. The headlights cut a bright, clean path through the white darkness. I was alone, and I was in the middle of a Montana winter, but I wasn't cold. I felt a heat in my chest that had nothing to do with the furnace in the house. It was the heat of personal freedom. It was the knowledge that I had built my own world, stone by stone, while they were busy looking at the clouds. I reached the end of the driveway and turned onto the main road. The truck handled the slush with ease. I was driving toward the city, toward the life I had built in the shadows, toward the future that was now entirely mine to command. The lights of the house faded in the rearview mirror until they were just a faint yellow glow against the white of the mountains. And then they were gone. I was out on the highway, a clean, well-lighted road stretching out before me. I was a young woman in her late 20s, with a truck, a bank account, and the cold, hard truth of my own resilience. It was a good way to start the year. It was the only way to live. I turned up the heater and drove into the night. The engine's hum fades as the screen yields to a quiet winter dusk. That was the silence of Kate Reynolds, a silence that held more power than the loudest voices in that room. If you enjoyed this journey through the cold Montana night, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.